Welcome to Writing the Wrong Way, the podcast for writers who strive to be bold and readers who crave something new. I'm your host, Jonathan Ball. I want to thank you for being here, and I want us to stay in touch. So subscribe to this podcast, then go to writingthewrongway.com and enter your best email to receive the Martian Embassy Missive, my bi-weekly newsletter where I let you know what's happening on Mars, where we're always making big plans. Join the Martians so you don't get left out of the invasion at writingthewrongway.com. And as a special bonus, I'll send you a free book. Speaking of books, my new book is called The National Gallery, and it contains sonnets about Leatherface from the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, elegies lamenting the death of my iPhone, and other strange missives from yours truly, the Poet Laureate of Hell. Visit thenationalgallery.ca to order your signed copy. That's thenationalgallery.ca. So I'm talking to Dave Bidini, who is the only person to have been nominated for a Gemini, Genie, and a Juno Award, and have a book featured for CBC's Canada Reads. He's a founder member of Rheostatics and the Bidini Band. He's written at least 13 books, has a 3-time National Magazine Award winner, and he's a publisher of the West End Phoenix community newspaper in Toronto. And you can subscribe outside of Toronto also, I understand, to the West End Phoenix. Is that right?
That's correct.
And so that's something that's definitely worth, your time doing if, you're stuck at home and need something to read in particular. Can I just maybe start with asking you, how you started the West End Phoenix? What is it that kind of got you moving in that direction to starting a community newspaper?
Yeah, and you just mentioned about, subscribing and not being in Toronto. With Miriam Taves is in our latest issue, and along with Kevin Barry, the great Irish writer. A lot of different writers beyond those that live in the neighborhood, writing about things other than the neighborhood. But I was reading the Yellowknifer, which is the community city newspaper. Yellowknife, Northwest Territories. The last book was based around those experiences, and I kind of, had a bit of a light turned on for me just in terms of reporting and local news, local journalism, community journalism, and what, and the importance of that paper to that city. And then coming back from that experience, writing the book and being in Toronto, and just sort of, every, the conversation about media largely where we are is about its, based upon its demise, and also becoming aware of the fact that all of the community newspapers that I remembered from growing up in the city had, either disappeared or have been bought by Metroland, the Toronto Star parent company, and basically devoured of all content and all heart. Places like the Parkdale Liberty and the Blue West Villager, which were, a substantial, long-standing community newspapers. Anyways, none of them were left. They weren't around. They do exist. The Villager exists in a depleted form, but I thought it was one opportunity to try something in this neighborhood in the West End part of Toronto, and just gave me an idea of sort of reimagining the community newspaper as it could exist in 2018, but it directly goes from my experiences being around the writers and reporters up north, and getting close to that operation that I was inspired to do this.
That kind of community news publication, and I think it's also really important for writers in terms of building a writing career. I mean, I know that
totally
kind of coming up, one of the most important things to me as a young writer was working on a student newspaper, and then moving on from that, I directly got hired to do a column to take the column into a community newspaper, the Uptown magazine here in Winnipeg, which was later bought by the Free Press, which is still an independent publication, the Winnipeg Free Press, but it's not quite the conglomeration that the Metro has become, but it's still, it's a bit of that trend of, things being absorbed into larger things. But it is something that I think some writers themselves suffer a little bit from, is that the lack of that venue that maybe is somewhat more accessible, but still very professional, and still a valuable place to be working in.
Yeah, in the book I argue, there's the Yellowknifer is imperfect. There's a lot of things that I think could be done to probably just make it more relevant, both to their city and community, and just also just as a global and a national voice of the North. But one of the great things about it is it's it's an available and accessible starter position for people at a J school. And we've seen, so many small town newspapers, community newspapers close. It's been a media genocide in a lot of ways. And those early places for people to cut their teeth and to learn how to work and learn how to write and learn how to be working journalists, just they're fewer and fewer these days. And that's, if for no other reason, that's an important use of journalism at that level, and everybody has to come from somewhere, and you don't step into you don't become a crime reporter at the Toronto Star, the, Montreal Gazette. Your first time around, you have to kind of move through and you have to learn those skills. So that's valuable. And also even for us with the Phoenix, and one of the things I've seen, in my life as a writer, really the last 15 years is the dearth of work. There was a time when, there was so many different, venues, forums for one's work, and a lot of those calls came from newspapers across the country asking me to write op-eds and stuff about national concerns generally, or if the story was about Toronto. And the calls just don't come anymore because, newsrooms have been gutted. The Gazette, I mentioned it, I think they had 5 years ago, they had a repertorial force of 241, and I think now they're down to 20. So we've seen the hemorrhaging, and we've seen how, there are fewer and fewer opportunities for everyone, not even just people that are starting, but also established writers too.
Now, one of the things that I think is this really starts to connect to a larger, kind of broader thing that I want to talk about, which is one of the things that I think is interesting about you and about people who, do different things, whose works in, nonfiction as a writer, as a musician and, publishing and so on. I really feel like there's a tendency in kind of modern age, on one hand, for people to want to pigeonhole you, but at the same time for that to be unsustainable from, in various respects. And I think, not you specifically, but, artists or writers in general. And I think one thing that's interesting to me about kind of somebody who's, kind of deep into career like you are, and still, kind of really working and turning things out is you found, I think, certain ways to, blend and cross over between these different things that you do. The most obvious being, of course, writing your book On a Cold Road about, sort of touring with Rheostatics. But even more broadly, I think there's a sort of there's a way in which, as a lyricist, you dealt very, frequently and, deeply with political and social issues. And so, and this is a very hard thing, I think, to write about in artistic fields in many respects, without, I think one thing that's kind of interesting about your work is I think in many respects successfully touched very specifically on particular things that were happening. Like, for example, I think of, Bad Time to Be Poor from Rheostatics and that Mike Harris period, or even like the Motherland album, which in many, certain songs are really tied to like Harper's America, with the, Bidini band. And I think about like just the way that like it's those works still have aged well in a way that a lot of material that gets really specifically tied to political or social issues doesn't necessarily age well. And I always wonder, like, how do you tackle, when you want to talk on a kind of specific issue or something that's kind of very much, current, how do you kind of approach that in a way where, the work's going to hold up? Or do you think too much about that? Or do you have any strategies in terms of dealing with that? I know it's kind of a big set of questions nestled together there, but I was curious to kind of dive into that issue with you.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's my sense of that, the intent of the work or the inspiration behind, some of the harder edged works, record too, but I think mostly music has sort of changed. I think in the beginning it was, being sort of, children of punk rock and even honestly like bands that wouldn't even have been defined as being punk, but would have, played with all of that heart, spirit, energy, and conviction, even like new wave, certain new wave bands. And, when you literally, when you saw those first wave of bands come over, from the UK, a few up from the States, and even some at home here, they were playing as if they were, playing for their lives, really, and playing for mercy almost. And there was just something really beautiful, and I think something that informed our aesthetic and our approach. From that, the bands that we loved weren't lazy. They were trying hard all the time, and often at the expense of the other choice that you would make, which would have been to kind of pursue that kind of soft level of success that a lot of people have. It's a trade-off, And I think what you find in Canada, because there are so few opportunities, there are so kind of few slots really for those that achieve a level of commercial success, that once you find it, you want to sustain it, and the way you become more appealing as a commercial entity is large in Canada, and I think a lot of the world, is largely by being safe and by not asking those hard questions of of humanity and of the world as it exists, and kind of turning away from the stronger flavors and choosing kind of sweet over sour. And there are moments where we sort of flirted with that kind of success, and it's fine for others, but it was just never fine for us, and we always felt it was a little bit of a betrayal. So whenever there were questions about, maybe we pare down the band to one singer, or maybe we play sort of more, less formless live performances, less improvisational. Maybe we kind of tailor them so that they make a little bit more sense to an audience that wouldn't have been exposed to us before. We just decided to not heed, that advice and direction. I think it cost us, a certain level of comfort, perhaps, and income and all that kind of stuff. But at the same time, for me personally, what it did is it sort of forced me to kind of figure out a way to be a surviving artist. And one of the ways that I think this is true of most people in our band is we just realized that we had to do other things to kind of support that way of approaching our music. And for me, it was writing in the beginning, and 92, 93, we were touring hard. Our third record, Whale Music, we toured that hard, and I was writing a column for the Toronto Star at the same time, and that column, eventually did produce On a Cold Road. And I also felt as well, even going back to high school, there was always that, I'm sure kids get it today still, but that whole, find an occupation, like you do that, those occupational surveys, right? And they tell you to be a farmer or a doctor or an accountant or whatever. But I never I didn't understand why you only ever had to do one thing. So, so I was comfortable, and it was, that in a way was also kind of an act of social defiance, like trying to do a lot of things well. And just because we were who we were as a band, it drove me to explore all those other means of expression and just ways of kind of supporting what we do. So, and it makes, if anything, it makes for really, like a lively existence, I think, partly. And one of the things the band did is it did give me access to those other, those other mediums. So if I, wanted to write a play, or if I was interested in, writing a book, or contributing to a newspaper or something like that, at least I had the band as kind of the signifier, so people knew, it's that guy from the Rheostatics. Okay, I like them, blah, 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 blah. They seem like good guys. And I think even with West End Phoenix, just in terms of talking, donors and supporters, people kind of had a sense that we would be able to sustain what we were doing because, I've been able to run a really weird band for the past 40 years and one that sort of has continued to survive. So it's a model that, probably I'm sure isn't for everybody, but it's one that we've been able to fashion for ourselves that we kind of like riding in.
And when you are trying to get more, when you're writing more specifically in that kind of political or social mode, what are the things you think are important to consider, or is there something that's important to consider? Like I think about now, I see so many people talking now about like, how are we going to write about this experience of being, of the coronavirus, of dealing with, all this COVID chaos. And you see, people on various sides of the fence about whether, it's possible, whether it should be done, whether it has to be done, et cetera, et cetera. Obviously, like there's no one answer to these sorts of things, but, if, say, for example, you're going to take any political or social issue and try to, like, write about it, write a song about it, for example, or even just write about it, in fiction or in nonfiction. What are the things you think a writer or person kind of tackling that has to consider?
It's funny because if for instance, if I was to think about writing about America, I know right now where they're at politically and socially and everything that's going on, with COVID-19 as its focus, for me it would almost be redundant because I feel like we've written those songs already, anyways, and it didn't take Donald Trump and it didn't take this virus to come along for us to suddenly realize, oh shit, this is the road down, the road that that country or that culture is headed, because the signs have been there for a long time. We wrote Rock Death America as a song on We All Music and Marginalized is another good example from 2067, a song about America. But it's also, when you're writing a politically focused song or one that's even kind of slyly political, not obviously political, brazenly political, you have to you kind of check your didactic meter a little bit. Like I always find that, storytelling can always go a long way towards, giving kind of depth to that, to a political, approach to a song. Two examples, I guess. One is, Feed Yourself was a song on Blue Hysteria, which is about a rape in a park, and the backdrop is Mike Harris's Ontario, just in the way that the public reacts, and the way I write about just the way the community reacts to the event, and that's one example. And then there are other just like protest songs, and I think Bad Times and Poor is kind of like that. Tim also wrote a song called Hands Off Our Schools, which we didn't release, but we recorded, which was, so sometimes it is like a finger to the chest, and other times it's a little bit, more painterly, I think. Even Horses from Melville, which is about the Gainers Meat Packer plant strike in 1986, I think, in Edmonton, is more lyrical, I think, as opposed to kind of just a strict kind of protest song. But it's clear, the impulse of that song and the heart of that song is obvious. It's just kind of, it's set up, it's dressed up as a bit more of a kind of like a playhouse of humanity rather than a very direct kind of sloganish political song, which has its place too. I just think you can do it a lot of different ways.
On your newer album, Here Come the Wolves, there's the song Music is a Message, which I think is really interesting because in many ways the lyrics of that song are about writing lyrics to a song in a certain sense. And you've got that great line of music is a message, the words all fly away. And I think there's a way in which, would you say there's a way in which in some respects that's sort of what's going to carry these songs through the ages, in a manner of speaking, whatever how do you go, music is still hitting.
That's interesting. I think that's true. I mean, I think it has to be a combination, probably. You're right. Like, you need the melody and the structure of the song to support what you're trying to say, for sure. And the best compositions probably have both of those things.
How do you find writing song lyrics being different from other types of writing?
Well, they're probably easier, honestly. I mean, like they have their own challenges because, like a poem, I suppose the lyrics are spare, and you have to be really exact. But then, like a book takes me 2 years to write, sometimes longer. A lyric can be hacked out in an afternoon. So, and also even with poetry, people like to, when Bob Dylan won the Nobel Prize, people like to talk about him being a poet. Well, I think, I think the poem it's extremely jealous of the lyric because the lyric has music to ferry it through, whereas the poem is stark, naked. It's much harder, I think, to write a great poem than it is to write a great lyric. Sorry,
I joke often that my career has been a regression of sorts because I was doing music years and years ago. I was never had that much success, although I weirdly and randomly had my photo in Rolling Stone. But then I moved from that into writing poetry and moving from that into writing fiction now. Just getting harder and harder with less and less rewards.
Right. Well, it's different. It really is. Yeah, it's man. One is the long form. The book is it's like the Olympics. Swimming. They have those 15,000 meter races or whatever, and they go on for not hours and hours, but it seems like it. And then you've got one length of the pool, so you're spending more time in the water and one and less time in the water than others. And I must say there are some songs, with well, Feed Yourself is a good example, but even Stolen Car, those songs lyrically for me took a long time to write. And I think in the case of Stolen Car, it was I knew the song there was something really lovely and special there, but so I wanted to honor the musical composition by writing a lyric that was equal to it, I think, and that it took a while to come there. So I guess it's easy for me to say those things about spending longer time in the water, but in fact, it can be the same too. It can, no matter what you're doing.
You also seem to me to be picking from time to time very hard subjects to write about, like hockey, for example. You write about hockey, which to me it seems like a difficult thing to do. I don't know if that's the case exactly, but to me, sports is one of those areas where it's kind of an ineffable thing they're trying to describe on some level.
It depends. I think. Listen, so much of it is like the angle that you decide to, approach it. And that's the fun part, honestly, is like, okay, I have a subject I want to write about, but really, it's sort of finally calibrating that angle, almost like a set of, a mathematician's tools, right? Like moving it around. So it just comes at it like with, Whale Music has a song on it called Queer, which is about a younger brother writing to his older brother who's come out to his family that's had to leave the home and has split. So he's writing to him to tell him about what life is like with their dad. And I knew I had that sort of narrative, and I thought, well, how can I set this narrative? And I decided to set it against a hockey game where the younger brother seeks a kind of retribution on his behalf by the other team that's, like calling his older brother a fag and this stuff, and he decides to exact vengeance by almost single-handedly beating this team. And it was useful to kind of, use the game like that as opposed to, it could have been done a lot of different ways, but it was nice to be able to kind of write about hockey, but making that song about more than hockey, right? Which I think the best kind of sports writing is probably like that anyway. So, it's part of creativity. I mean, it's hard work and stuff to get it where you want it to be, but the fun part for me is the play, I guess, is to move things around and play with ideas and trying to turn ideas upside down and put them on their side and see if you can find something new in that.
Now, Before I let you go, I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you what it was like to tour with Tragically Hip and hear one of the moments I imagine must have been pretty, fascinating. Or I'm curious to know what it was like to be sitting there when Gord Downing starts singing "Bad Time to Report" in the middle of nautical disaster.
Yeah, he did. We played before with them, and he did a little bit of Claire in one of the songs. Yeah, it was lovely, and it was those tours for us too. It wasn't so much that we were with them, although obviously it was they were great company and they were great hosts, and were encouraging to us, and obviously we're grateful and they helped our career a lot. But it was just a different reality for us as like longtime friends being together, experiencing that together. And I think really that's what was valuable about the experience. The fact that we were experiencing those gigs and those shows and that tour together. Kind of seeing that experience reflect back to each other, through each other, in terms of the way we played those shows, in terms of how it affected our songwriting and just our nature as performers, I think. So at the end of the day, it was, you've done a show and you've seen and experienced all of these things, but really, and I think probably the hip guys would tell you the same thing. It's that time kind of when you're together and everything has already happened and it's behind you, that, when you start to process it and talk about it and be together in it, those are the times that you really remember the most. And that's probably what I take away mostly from those experiences. The art was great, and seeing, those guys do their thing every night was great. And, I knew Gord pretty well before we did those tours, so it wasn't like I got to know him well on the road. But time spent with him was obviously a joy.
Did keeping that tour diary, which you kind of used as the basis for some of the Cold Road book, how did you approach that in terms of, not only a document that, you're using to process these experiences, but also something that maybe you're planning to, write from later? Is there a way that you approached keeping that? I wrote that. I wrote the tour diary up for the Toronto Star for their entertainment section, and then so I was approached by an agent, Paul Corrington's agent, who asked if I'd want to develop it into a book. Blah 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 blah. I was like, I had not thought about it at all, honestly. And then I thought it would be interesting, but I thought to myself, well, first of all, it probably, because I was insecure about the craft and intimidated and daunted by the prospect of having to write a book, but I was also, I really didn't think people would want to read 300 pages of me writing about what the catering was like backstage at the Winnipeg Arena. I thought, how can I make this book a little bit more altruistic and a little less narcissistic? Because writing about oneself is such a narcissistic act on one level. So that's when I decided that it would be interesting to, fan in all of the stories from all the other performers, the performers who went ahead of us in the 60s and 70s. Because I'd met a lot of interesting musicians anyways. Prior to that, we met a blues band in the Royal Albert Hotel in 1987 that had remarkable stories of their lives in music. And so I thought it would be really interesting to draw all of their stories into it, to kind of, add some meat to the book, fatten it, and just also make it a little less about me and more just kind of about the greater musical community. So that was, and I think that idea kind of came about. Like, I think the concept of the book being a tour
River Diary with the Tragic Hip, which is kind of sold like that. And then I kind of developed it before I was meeting my editors early on about how the book might kind of happen. They were excited about that too, so I knew it would kind of work.
Well, thanks so much for talking to me, and people listening, make sure you check out the West End Phoenix. I'll link to it, but of course, if you search the West End Phoenix, you'll get a bunch of information about that. The latest album, Rheostatics, is Here Come the Wolves, which is worth listening to and has some really excellent material on it for sure. Bidini Band's Motherland's an album I really recommend as well, in terms of recent albums especially. And thanks again for talking to me. And to everyone else, thanks for listening and keep writing your own way.